welcome to the 2021 Virtual Vanderbilt Summer Science Academy. Today is Wednesday, which means we are talking about the medical school path, the MD path. And, this whole summer we have been working up to this pinnacle. I am so honored to have Dr. Andre Churchwell here to talk. He and I have been colleagues for years, and I have to tell you, I'm excited just to hear his story, let alone to be able to offer that to you guys to be able to hear as well. So thank you so much, Andre, for being here. We're lucky to have you.
Great. Well, thank you, Beth, for asking me. And one of my great joys is talking to young students who are building their careers, whether it be in science, math, engineering, humanities, or looking for careers in research or in careers in medicine, and or some amalgamation of all three. And so that'll be part of kind of one of the themes from my talk. I'm a cardiologist, and I'm a practicing cardiologist. My other role has been in the medical school for many years, 14, 15 years, combining Emory and Vandy to work on medical school admissions, as well as building a diverse and inclusive climate in the medical school and medical center. And more recently, as I stepped away from that, just in the last few days, I am the Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the university. So I went from kind of learning what I learned on a somewhat smaller scale to now take that to a larger scale and maybe influence the journey of equity, diversity, inclusion for our students, staff, and faculty here at the university, and probably still have some connections back to the medical school and the medical center for sure, because that's home base. So one of the things I'd like to share with you is kind of my life's journey, and I'll do it in a way that offers me some self-criticisms and some analysis along the way. I think one of the important things, Beth, when we give these talks, I think it's important for the students to know that I did not descend from Mount Olympus this morning in my chariot and land here at Vanderbilt, meaning I have godlike powers, I've never made a mistake, or I didn't come from Asgard, off the Bifrost, off the Rainbow Bridge with Milner in hand to spin down with Thor and land here. No, I came from East Nashville, Tennessee, which is about 10 minutes from here. I can't see my home from here, too many buildings, but it's about, well, I was raised in East Nashville by Robert and Mary Churchwell, many years ago in the beginning of the civil rights movement. So I'm a child of the late 50s and 60s and 70s and so forth. So I've been around a bit, seen a number of things, learned a lot from mistakes and errors, and that's important because learning is an active process that you're engaged in now, trying to embed or inculcate new knowledge or new experiences into either experiential learning by what you're doing and seeing versus what I call more pedagogical, bookish learning from what you're reading and analyzing and kind of inculcating into some type of mental framework. And so, but the other part of learning is the learning through what I call acts of unexpected resilience training. And what those are acts of errors, mistakes, and there's actually maybe even more learning in some of us from that than the rest of it. As a physician, unfortunately, you learn from errors. You learn from patient illness or patients induced illness that you may have caused, or for that matter, patients who've passed. Despite all of your efforts, what did you learn from that patient so that you could pass that on to the next patient in terms of their success? So that's a huge part of it. The other aspect of your learning that I've touched 3 or 4 is along the way, learning to recognize you don't know everything. The last person I think in the history of mankind who was felt to know everything that was known to be known was in the medieval age, and that was Erasmus. It was a medieval clergyman who, there was a finite set of library books back then, and he apparently knew everything that could be known. But I'll tell you right now, that's not the case now for any of us. Each day there's thousands of new publications, pages of publications coming out. New knowledge is turning over, just it's infinitely much faster than it was a few decades ago. So you have to learn to live with uncertainty when you're making decisions. That was described beautifully in physics by the Heisenberg principle, right? Not knowing where an electron in its shell might be. You don't know where that is spinning. So the uncertainty principle as applied to knowledge gaining and knowledge seeking and decision making is that no matter what you do, whether it be on the wards at midnight with a sick patient in front of you that's trying to die, or whether you're sitting in your classroom working on an experiment, there will be, just by the nature of life and the serendipity of that, there'll be moments in which you don't know everything you need to know, but you still will have to be able to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty and be comfortable with that, so that you can continue on in your journey as a physician, caregiver, or scientist, or physician scientist. So those are the 4 or 5 types of learnings or ways of learning that I have kind of come to believe that are valuable for myself. But let's go back in time. Life journey started here in Nashville. My parents, Robin and Mary Churchwell, have gone on to their glory. They've done all they could do for us, and they passed on. And as I always say, Dad left first to kind of make the way clear for us in 2009 at age 92. My dad was a product of the greatest generation. He was born in 1917, during World War I, for that matter. And he grew up in Clifton, Tennessee, a little western town west of here, country town at the foot of the Tennessee River. It was a site of a major Civil War battle, but it was where a number of plantations and small farmers, white farmers, had farms. And as it turns out, we actually doing a little work when we did a centennial celebration of my dad's life in 2017. We visited that little town and found a whole host of Churchwells that make up a rainbow coalition. They're white, brown, black, all hues of the rainbow. And it also allowed us to do some research and find that our family came from a small white dirt farmer named John Churchwell. Not every plantation, not every enslaved African-American story begins on Tara, this Gone with the Wind lush mansion, or at the Hermitage down the street here, large mansion here in Tennessee that Andrew Jackson had on the Bellmead Plantation. Most of the white owners of enslaved Africans were poor and had small farms, and generally only a few enslaved Africans. And John Churchwell, who migrated here from England, his family did, had maybe 8 to 10 enslaved Africans. And we, going back finding the census data, even back in the early part of the middle of the 19th century, we could find the birth of the first Churchwell as we know it here in this country was Isom Churchwell. As defined, the names of his parents were not clearly delineated. They were enslaved Africans, but he was named Isom Churchwell. And it turns out we followed his career through his life path. And my grandfather was one of his 6 sons. And my grandfather, Jesse Churchwell, had 4 children, and my dad was the second oldest, Robert Churchwell, born in 1917. My grandfather was born in 1896. And so only a few generations or less from slavery, right? So the knowledge of that's very proximal to me and my family and our understanding, as it is for most African Americans here in Tennessee or in this country. And so my dad, thank goodness, my grandfather married a brilliant woman, as it's always good to marry someone smarter than you are, who had gone to school, elementary school, and a small junior college finishing school for African American women, believe it or not, at the turn of the 20th century. And she could play the piano, and she embedded in Dad a love for books, reading, and music. And that was the saving grace, because as he finished high school here at Pearl and went to World War II, both in the European theater in the Battle of the Bulge and in the Philippines, my goodness, he came back and finished his time at the GI Bill here at Fisk University, where he was truly swept along by the current of prominent Black intellectuals who migrated here from the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s and took upon themselves leadership positions at Fisk in the art department, the English department. The president of the college, Charles Johnson, was one of the founding members of the Harlem Renaissance. So he brought a boatload of absolutely brilliant, gifted African-American writers and poets and artists. And one of the leading artists of the Harlem Renaissance, Aaron Douglas, came here and started the Fisk art department. And Dad just was totally overwhelmed by the immense quality of their intellect, their level of the depth of their discussions, the degree of reading that they'd undergone and taken place. And he just grabbed it all. And that was the story of his life in terms of the investment in the life of the mind. He did that. He took the 5 naughty head little kids that he and mama had and in his best way, invested those ideas about the life of the mind and its importance in our little brains. And he did it through very unique lessons, and I'll come back to that. He married Mary Churchwell. Mom is from Bell Buckle, Tennessee, which is a trotting horse town, farm city town. It's not a city, it's a farm that's southwest of here, maybe about 30, 40 miles. And it's notable for walking horses, as well as the Webb School, a private preparatory school that's been there since the end of the Civil War. That oddly enough is a finishing school for potentates. Princesses around the world have sent their kingdoms have sent their sons to little Webb schools for their education. So there have been kings of Syria, have sent kids here, their kids here. So it's kind of amazing. But Mom was raised in a farming family that owned their land there, and her mom, my grandmother, Viola Churchwell, Buckingham, sorry, the name was Buckingham, had to raise the family because her husband was a casualty of health disparity. So my grandfather on my mom's side, Henry Buckingham, had a massive intracranial hemorrhage, apparently, from untreated hypertension in the late 30s, early 40s, right around or right before World War II. So my grandmother had to take on raising 4 children and running the farm and running the men that ran the farm. And so she is a truly larger than life. She did descend from Mount Olympus because she could shoot a gun, a rifle at 200 yards better than anybody ever met, could fish and hunt and gig frogs and milk cows and work hours of labor much longer than anybody I've ever seen in my entire life. I worked much harder when I was on the farm in the summer with her than I had at any time in my life. It's amazing, indefatigable woman who died at age 99. And her mother, who lived on the farm, died at 105, Lizzie. So there's a lot of longevity. Mom left us at age 89 in February of 2020 after a long career with us. Right. So Mom, when she finishes elementary school and ready to go to high school, there's no high school in Bell Buckle for Black. It's a segregated Jim Crow South. So her mother calls a friend of hers that had moved to Nashville, had a boarding school, and said she had a room for Mom if she could get there. So Mom at age 15, grandmother packed her bag, made her a bunch of lunches, and she hitchhiked from Bell Buckle, Tennessee to Nashville, Tennessee at age 15 or 16. And I dare anybody here to be able to do that. I sure as heck couldn't. So I come from people who I think did descend from Mount Olympus, just amazingly hardworking folks. And so the lessons inculcated were from hard work and Dad about a life of the mind. And he did it in a number of ways. And he got us on the road to careers that were connected to academics. And so my older brother, Robert, is the legacy principal for Dad's school that's named after him, the Robert Churchwell Museum Magnet School. Go visit that on D.B. Todd Boulevard. Has a lot of his sayings all over the wall, drawings, paintings. And I went on, not in journalism like that. Dad's a journalist. Dad actually is in the African-American Smithsonian Museum. He was the first African-American to write on a newspaper in the South. And he came to that in 1949 when he finished Fisk. The Nashville Banner hired him. And he was the first person. He wrote for the Banner for over 40 years. Enduring racism, not able to sit in the city room, not able to go to the cafeteria, just really terrible stuff that he hid from us for years. We only found out a few years before he passed away. Just an amazingly gifted, huge, larger than life man, sacrificed. Brilliant though. And so inculcated all the power of writing and reading. And I went into science. Science and math was my way. So I went to public school here and got into Vanderbilt University in engineering. But I wanted to go into medicine because I saw the blending of academics and people skills that medicine allowed you to have. But my first interest was certainly medicine, cardiology, and research. So when I finished Vanderbilt biomedical engineering, I went to Harvard Med School, and there did a lot of work in my fourth year doing research with a very gifted man, Thomas McMahon, who taught me a lot of things. I don't have time to go into everything there, but from there to Emory for an internship and residency in cardiology training under the great Willis Hurst, the most notable bedside cardiologist probably in the 20th century, and wrote the definitive textbook on heart disease called Hurst the Heart. So I spent 13 years at his feet learning everything I could about how being a doctor, being a physician. At the same time, still having this interest in research, spent an engineering background, spent about 5-6 years working in aerospace engineering with Georgia Tech with the chair of aerospace engineering, looking at coronary artery fluid mechanics as a way to understand where early atherosclerotic lesions might land in the coronary arteries in kids who are dying from, who are and people who develop atherosclerosis in coronary artery disease. And so we studied that, looking at the data, the pathology of the 18-year-olds who were killed in the Korean War, where the data was available on where early lipid plaques were in their arteries. We studied that and found that there were clearly rheologic reasons why there were early lesions and why they were there. But after the important lesson in all of that, I think that I want you all to walk away with is, so at this point, I'm now running a research lab that's funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the NIH. I have a wife with 2 young kids. I have embarked on a clinical career at Emory as a clinical cardiologist running the echo lab at Emory. And at the same time, because of my people skills, I've been asked to start the Emory Division of Diversity and Inclusion for the medical school. So the early diversity inclusion office I started. And one day after about a year doing this and being successful, I got called in to Dr. Hurst's office. And my wife was there with him. And Dr. Hurst was an amazingly gifted, thoughtful man, a surrogate father, who said, "Andre, you're doing spectacular. This is not to be called in for something you've done wrong. You're publishing, you're teaching, you're winning teaching awards. But you know what? You're not getting home in time. You're not seeing your family. Your wife's worried about you. I'm worried. If she's worried about you, I'm worried about you. You're gifted. You can do all of these things, but I want you to take the whole week off. I took away all your duties. And I want you to go someplace and think about, what do you see yourself doing for the next 30 years in your life? Those 1 or 2 things you want to focus that you'll have the most energy and passion about." So that's a lesson for you all. First off, I want you to sample and dabble in a lot of stuff. But at some point you need to come back and decide, like, what are the 1 or 2 things I'm going to really focus my energies on at some point in my career? Okay. And the way you do that, you do a column of your strengths and your weaknesses. And you also have in the middle column, what could you envision getting up every morning at 5 o'clock and being excited to do for the next 30 years? If that one doesn't hit the right spot, then that tells you one of those things comes off the list. So I did that. He had me take a week off. And so I went someplace and up in the hills or something, to a refuge, and studied it and came back and said, "Dr. Hurst, I want to be a clinical cardiologist. I derive so much from what I get from my patients. It is such a privileged position to be in the lives of people and their families as I help them along the way with their heart and medical conditions. There's nothing quite like that. It's almost like the ministry." And he smiled at me and said, "You're right. You're right." And then I said, also, though I can do research, I think my greatest strengths could be and would be how I could influence young people going forward from diverse backgrounds into medicine, being a diversity leader. And he had written down on a piece of paper on his desk what he thought I was going to say, and he flipped it over, and that's what he had written down. So he knew me. He was like my other daddy. So that's what I've done the rest of my career. I focused intensely for the last 30 years on that. And this journey has allowed me to be in the life of so many patients. There's a book out that one of my mentors from Harvard Med School wrote called On Being a Physician by Roman DeSanctis. And his picture's over here on the wall. He wrote a book about being called, this is about doctoring, 59 years of doctoring and still going. And what he has derived from that and the lessons he's learned about himself and what he's learned from other patients along the way. And in the inside of the book, even before the text, he describes the text, he lists the key elements of what it is he has learned about himself and what he has brought to this. Compassion, kindness, sensitivity, understanding. If you can maximize those, you'll be a better human being. You'll be also a great physician. And you'll be a great scientist too, to be honest with you. And so that's kind of my sense of what I wanted you to hear from me before I delve into a couple other things, because my time's getting short here, but I want you to think about, and right now you dabble. This is the time to explore those interests, because part two of my comments to you is cultivate your right brain. Most of what I've talked about with you are left brain cultivations, the actions of what you're going to do in the day, the deterministic decisions you make about patients and your research. But it turns out you need to spend as much time on the right brain, the metaphorical right brain, the real right brain, that's connected to the left brain by the corpus callosum, where a lot of the creativity is invested, is built. And creativity informs every decision you make. And the best example I can tell you is to read Walter Isaacson's book on the life of Leonardo da Vinci. It came out a couple of years ago. The best example I can think of where you have right brain informing the left brain and vice versa. So to be able to move from art to mathematics to design back to art in a quick heartbeat would be a skill I would really recommend you look at. And the thing I would discern, there's a book called How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci, and you should get that. It's a paperback book. And I've got one here, but you can order it. The author is Michael Gelb, G-E-L-B, who spent 3 years walking in the footsteps of Da Vinci from his home to where he died in France. And he read all of Da Vinci's books that in his books, though it's written backwards, he describes how he thought, why he thought a certain way, why he practiced certain techniques to enhance his skills of recognition or sensitivity to see things or feel things. For example, he would every morning before he'd go do any work at the easel, he'd sit in a certain room in his home and look out the window at a tree or a garden out there, and he would study what he would see on the tree and then close his eyes and put his head down and meditate for a few minutes and then raise up and open his eyes slowly and ask, what did he not see the first time? He didn't see there was a robin nest on the top branch. He didn't see that there were a few buds of fruit or apples growing on that side of the tree. So he didn't have these iPhone things. So he had to amplify his own sensory mechanisms to help him see more, feel more, understand more. Okay. And so take a look at that book. It's a good one. And so cultivate your right brain. Find out what it is you love that's creative, whether that for me is art, drawing, maybe it's making music, maybe it's sculpture, maybe it is, it could be any number of things, ceramics, prose, writing. Even if we're not expecting everybody to be Da Vinci, but the mere action or the act of doing those things with your right brain create connections and inform your decision-making process in ways you would not even imagine. So even if you're a lousy artist, just the mere attempt that you're trying creates connections there and creates pathways that allow you to have ideas that you would not. So that's number two. Number three is take care of your brain. At the beginning of each year, when Dr. Hurst would meet the new interns, it'd be about this time of year, he would begin his welcoming remarks. This is how he always started. Welcome to Emory and Grady Hospital. My job as the chair of medicine is to impress medicine into your brain and training. But I want you to recognize that you have to take care of your brain because it's the only one the Lord gave you. He gave you two arms, gave you two legs, but you only have one brain. So I would avoid those things that could be toxic to the brain's ability to work at a high level all the time. Alcohol, drugs, all these other things that you would probably think about. That was really an important lesson. You only have one of them. Take care of it. And then lastly, and as I close with you all, I said it before, there are no wrong paths to success. Uh, you just heard me as I was going down 4 or 5 at one time. And so I think it is really important to explore. And there's a great writer named Wendell Berry who lives in Kentucky who writes about the loss of the university in a little short piece essay he's written, and how he makes the case as a former English professor that students are so keen about developing career paths rather than paths, as my dad said, to a life of the mind. Read widely. You may study biology, but I would recommend you read widely. That means literature, that means autobiographies, that means other books that will offer you other ways of thinking and novel ways of thinking that you'll glean from the autobiography of Teddy Roosevelt or any great leader or successful person. And so wide variety of reading, really important for the rest of your life, okay? It will then inform all of what you're doing in your day job again. It helps inform that day job stuff. So those are my comments to you in my 28 minutes and 30 seconds. I really think that it's an important lesson about learning through error. Churchill, as he began to fight the German and the Italian axis, he was getting England was getting their butt kicked over there, as you probably know. Belgium was, France was, and when he was asked about this, he said success is going from failure to failure without losing your enthusiasm for success, and that's what sometimes errors or failure does. I will share one quick story here. When I was an intern at Grady, I was really committed to learn to be the best physician I could be. And one of my first patients I remember admitting was an elderly African-American woman in her 80s who came in severely anemic. We weren't sure why she was so anemic, but she was profoundly anemic. Her hematocrit was like at a level I'd never heard of before, her hemoglobin. And she clearly was symptomatic from this. So I organized transfusion based on what I'd learned in med school and how I was taught, and arranged the transfusion. And turns out I wrote the orders and I went home. When I came back the next morning, the bed was empty. Her bed was empty. She had passed away in the night. And I went to find out what happened. The head nurse sent me downstairs to the morgue, and I went to the morgue, and there she was, and there was her chart. And as I dug into this, it turns out that the orders I wrote were not taken off until hours later, like maybe at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And the nurses, tired as they were, hung the blood, but because they didn't have a specific type of a pump that would regulate the flow of blood into her veins, they used a little cheap thing that we call dial-a-flow it's very inaccurate, and it could come loose. It actually constricts the tubing, so it kind of regulates the rate. Has a little timer thing on it. And that thing apparently came loose, and the blood flooded into her vein system, and she died of suffocation from fluid overload. And so I found that, I went through that. I remember sitting down there crying like crazy as I was going through that chart, digging. Then I spent the whole afternoon in the library reading about anemia and the treatment of anemias, and just becoming just totally engrossed in finding everything I could find about this condition that she had. And then I created a little book that I had in my pocket around those types of issues. And so for the rest of my career, I have a burning passion about the treatment of anemia, and I keep up on that. I read about it when new things come out. Horrible that she would die. I went to her funeral, sat with her family. So I fulfilled my role as someone who was allowed into her life the cherished position, the cherished opportunity to be in the life of this elderly woman and her family. Got to know them, and but it has informed everything I do. So, hope that's helpful, Beth.
Oh, Andre, I could hear you talk for hours. This is just wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of your story, your family history, all the way through the transitions you've made. So many golden nuggets in there. That quote, success is, living through different failures. I'm going to have to look that up. That is incredibly powerful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I hope you all have a great summer and a great kickoff to your careers.
Thank you so much. Appreciate seeing you here.
Check out our website to find recordings of all of our videos. We'll get them posted about a week after each of the presentations. We can't wait to see you.